pleasure to be with you all tonight. It's so cool to see all the different places that you're tuning in from. I am tuning in from the Bay Area, and it is my pleasure to introduce Matthew Hayek, who I know is joining us from New York. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies. He received his Ph.D. in Environmental Science and Engineering from the Harvard John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Prior to that, he received his bachelor's degree in physics from Wesleyan University. Hayek's research quantifies the environmental impacts of our food system with a specific focus on greenhouse gas emissions and contributions to climate change. He has previously published in the areas of atmospheric physics, forest terrestrial ecology, and agricultural management. His most recent paper concerns the relative impacts of grass-fed versus conventional beef production on methane emissions and land use in the US. His current project analyzes the land use requirements of food production more broadly, examining regional and global opportunities for reforestation and negative carbon emissions entailed by shifting toward a more efficient consumption patterns and production systems. Prior to joining NYU, Hayek was a postdoctoral science and policy researcher at Harvard Law School in the Animal Law and Policy program. He has previously taught courses on Earth systems, fluid mechanics, and global change biology. Welcome, Matthew. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
It really is wonderful to have you here because we have some major fans of yours in the audience, including two of our staff members have taken your courses at NYU. So this is a very full circle moment for some of us. All right, so we want to get into the basics first. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose to focus on the climate impacts of our food systems and what is important for people to know about these links?
Yeah, so what personally got me into being kind of interested on the side in environmental impacts versus taking it on as my full-time career was my PhD research, where I was, as you mentioned, I was at the Harvard Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Science, where I was flying and then driving into old-growth Amazon rainforests in the eastern Amazon in Brazil, and trying to understand through measuring the trees themselves and the gases in the atmosphere that the trees were exchanging, how potentially vulnerable or resilient to climate change those trees were, the Amazon rainforest is, as well as how much they potentially act as a buffer against impending climate change, or how vulnerable they are to further drought from exacerbating more climate change. While this was going on, we were researching these old-growth forest sites, and every time we drove into our forest site, we drove down this long highway south of Santarém, Brazil. And on the right was this large national forest, and on the left were just miles and miles of cleared field, trampled clay red soils, smoldering ashes, and an occasional truck coming out of these fields with big logs of mahogany. So I had originally thought that this was due to logging, the kind of standard story that we get around Amazon deforestation ever since the movie Fern Gully came out in the early 90s. It wasn't until my second or third trip that I realized that the vast amount of deforestation going on there, more than 95%, was due to beef production. And that's not factory farmed beef production, by the way. That is free range, pasture, grass-fed beef production. And so I realized very poignantly that while I was doing this research to understand the vulnerability of these intact forests in 30, 50 to 100 years' time due to anthropogenic climate change, they were disappearing literally across the street from me yesterday. And that was due to our food choices and the rising demand for meat and dairy products. So it was it was kind of gnawing at me for a while until I did my first talk on the subject, kind of a talk like this one, although a little bit more formal, and realized that I actually went from researching this as a side interest to having some really deep hypotheses that I could test and questions that I could answer using models and data science. So that was my trajectory, and I think it's incredibly important that folks in the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition realize the global interconnectedness of this problem. So I can say a lot more about that in a while, but I'm curious to have
This is
more of a conversation.
interesting. And I see that somebody also remembers Fern Gully being a very impactful movie. I also traveled to the Amazon once when I was a teenager, and it had a huge impact on me to really see that deforestation. And to this day, I talk about it all the time. It's a huge part of the environmental impact that we go over in our presentations. And as you know, that's not even necessarily the factory farmed animal products that we're talking about, but It's certainly something that we've had to bring up a lot, especially because of I'm in California, and there's so much interest in the fires and understanding the fires and the deforestation in the Amazon, how that's related to food has been a really important topic. I
Absolutely.
wanted to take a moment to ask you a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions. I noted in one of the talks that you gave recently at UC Berkeley, you cited that global food systems contribute 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. And you very specifically said that there should be a huge asterisk next to that number because it's very unclear, I think, to a lot of us who are doing this work and like spouting off these facts, because we don't really understand what is included in those numbers. You know, you talked about how if you're burning oil, you can measure the barrels, the exact number of barrels, but it's a lot more unclear. So can you tell us what is included when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions when it comes to food?
Right. So the things that are included in almost every report that you read about food system wide emissions are uh, land use and land use change. That is what happens before the farm is established to get it to be a farm or to turn one type of farm into another farm, right? All of that is land use and land use change. Predominantly, we're talking about clearing, tillage, deforestation, but it also might be reforestation from land that we've abandoned if a country gets more efficient in terms of their food production. But for the most part, globally, it's deforestation, and most of that is happening in the global south or around the tropics, including the Amazon rainforest. Then there's another large part of that that's often counted, which are methane and nitrous oxide emissions that come from the actual fields and animals where we're producing our food, right? Those are non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases. The land clearing causes carbon dioxide, but the farms themselves predominantly cause methane and nitrous oxide, which are two non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And they're a bit shorter lived in the atmosphere, but we're emitting them at pretty high rates, and each molecule warms the atmosphere differently than CO2. Then there's what are called kind of pre and post production emissions, or you could also call them supply chain emissions. Things like burning fossil fuels like natural gas to manufacture the fertilizers that are then put on the field that evaporate as and oxidize as nitrous oxide that we do count, right? But the actual burning of the fossil fuels like the natural gas should also be counted. And there are a number of things like, the manufacture of pesticides, the refrigeration that we use in the food system, the waste coming out of landfills for the proportion of landfills that is the food we throw away. Different reports take all of those supply chain or pre and post production emissions into different account. So these reports largely agree that the amount of emissions that come from clearing land and on farms is about a fifth to a quarter of global 20 to 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a big debate about how many other emissions in the rest of the supply chain you include on top of that. And that's what really caused these reports to range from 21% all the way up to 37 or 39% when all of those other things are included.
Yes, and that's been very confusing for those of us who talk about these issues, like seeing that huge range. And
Yeah.
then what happens is we're giving a presentation when we include the citations in all of our slides, and then it seems like there are things that are being updated, and we're unsure of like which exact sources to use. And I've seen questions earlier from folks that came in about what is the source that you would trust, and they specifically have been mentioning the EPA,
The what?
the EPA, their
Oh, the
numbers.
EPA. Yeah. So, you know, I think our food systems truly are global, so I would point to a global number. Because things that we eat in the United States might be sourced from a different country, or if we're not eating them, they're likely to get exported from our country to another one. We are kind of a bread basket and meat basket for much of the rest of the world. As weird as it is to say meat basket, I didn't mean to say that. Um, we really need to think about the commodities markets as globally interconnected, at least for every country that isn't merely subsistence or agrarian economy. So, right, the EPA numbers are for the US only. And that number, of course, is lower because it's only the US, and the proportion relative to all other emissions is lower because the US emits so many fossil fuels. We are the second most emissive country in the world, despite containing only about 3 or 4% of the world's population. So that makes the emissions from US agriculture seem small by comparison. And in fact, the beef industry loves to say that beef are only 3.3 or 3.7% of US emissions. Sure. I've seen that science. It's pretty much right. I can describe why it may have biases or uncertainties in certain directions, but it's pretty sound. But 3.3% of American emissions is all of the emissions of another country like Algeria or the Netherlands, like a developed country, an entire developed country's economy elsewhere. If US agriculture were a country, it would be the 14th largest emitting country in the world, right? So I think we are a bit too hung up when we look at percentages. It can be great as a talking point, but if we really want to drill down, do the math, do the science, do the hard social and technological work of stopping greenhouse gas emissions and pulling some of them out of the atmosphere, we need to focus on what is every little slice that we can take. And anything that's even a fraction of a percent, as far as I'm concerned, is on the table.
Sure, absolutely. I think what I'm noticing is a tendency for different groups to be using the percentages that feel most helpful to them. Like you said that the beef industry, for example, wants to give the 3% number. I've seen the groups that are really trying to just promote a plant-based diet giving much higher numbers. So
Yeah.
I think that that's again like leading to a lot of the confusion that we're seeing.
It is. And predominantly I see folks in the plant-based animal protection, animal advocacy movements give those 51, 79, 82% numbers that are, in order to kind of prove their point, to have something where they can kind of stick it and drive home a lot of the guilt around climate change being focused predominantly around animal agriculture. And it would be convenient if that was true, but none of the science attests to it. And I can tell you why. Right? Because we can actually measure in the atmosphere not only how many of each greenhouse gas emission is going up and over what portion of time, but we can use models to follow those wind fields and trace them to the large, sections of entire countries where those emissions came from. And we would know if we were missing most of those greenhouse gas emissions that were supposedly coming from fossil fuels, but were supposedly actually coming from animal agriculture. Atmospheric scientists would have known that information for decades at this point, which is why when you bring the more cockamamie numbers up to folks working hard for decades in the climate space, it really leaves us prone to immediate dismissal because the facts, the science don't back it up. So the best number, I think, is one that's slightly conservative, but is accurate. It's the 15% of global emissions, around 15% of global emissions come from animal agriculture. That's from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States. And it's an update of the 18% number from 2006. It was updated in 2014. Okay, which is it, 18% or 15%? They're actually the same number. The numerator of that fraction stayed the same. It's around 7 gigatons or billion of tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year. It's just the denominator that's changed because countries are developing, right? And they're developing with a lot more, bigger transportation sectors, more gas and coal-fired power plants. So the targets change every year. And since then, the numerator has changed a bit as well. But the point is, I think we don't need to get so hung up on the percentage because, again, anything more than 1% is worthy of serious mitigation. And
Mm-hmm.
using larger and inflated numbers detracts from the fact that we are primarily experiencing a climate emergency due to the burning of fossil fuels for transportation and energy and manufacturing. That is the lion's share of the climate problem, and no new calculus can detract from that fact. But animal agriculture is a substantial fraction, and without even addressing that 15% of emissions, even if we do everything to get rid of the additional 85% and have an entirely renewable energy economy, a recent study came out in Science that says that 15%, that remaining fraction, or rather the entire food system, the 26 or 30%, will take us beyond our kind of climate budget, or it will take us beyond 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius of warming, above which the climate problem is an increasingly dangerous one.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate you laying all that out. we have been talking about this 15% number, and it's been really critical because we are trying to speak to environmental audiences, people who are climate scientists, and we want to be taken seriously. And for a long time, we were seeing those really inflated numbers. So thank you for clarifying that. Okay, I want to get into some of these breakthroughs now. My first question is, what do you think is most underreported about the impacts of animal agriculture on climate change and environmental unsustainability?
Right. So globally, we know very well what the approximate amount of methane and nitrous oxide coming from animals themselves are. But there are two things that have kind of been undercounted or underappreciated in the past. And particularly, the first one is that whenever we estimate the emissions that are coming from intensive, you know, CAFO and factory farms, as they're called, we tend to underreport those emissions, including the numbers that the US EPA and the FAO reports. And we know that actually from my time at the Harvard Engineering School. I had close colleagues that would analyze measurements coming from planes and tall towers in areas that were adjacent, roughly adjacent, to large areas of animal production. And anytime we've measured them from the air, we've seen about 30 to 90% more emissions coming from intensive animal factory style farming, animal farming, than are expected by the models that the US EPA and the FAO uses. This does not mean that animal agriculture, of course, is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And it also means that this is a bit of a misconception among many, including those in the animal movement and in the locavore movement. Factory farming produces fewer greenhouse gas emissions per unit of meat or dairy produced than free range and pastoral styles of animal agriculture. This is not a pass for all of the other potential harms that factory farming causes, but it is a more quote unquote efficient way to raise meat, not just in terms of the producer's costs, but the amount of greenhouse gases that are coming from these facilities. So if you can imagine that, like, pastoral is up here, and according to all the models, right, pastoral is here and factory farming is here. What I'm saying is that when we look at the emissions of this from the air and try to cross corroborate it, it brings them up to more like here. It makes that gap of improvement smaller, which has major repercussions for the fact that US and Brazilian based conglomerates producing meat and dairy and our international banks are increasingly exporting the technologies that we have here that are supposedly way more efficient, right? We are exporting them to China, the Philippines, sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. So this lack of improvement is something that really needs to be discussed more. Those results are forthcoming in environmental research letters. They should be out by me and my colleague at Harvard, who I went to Harvard Graduate School with, who's now a PI or professor at Johns Hopkins. It's coming out from the both of us next month in environmental research letters.
Thank you so much, Matthew. There's a lot that we can talk about in terms of this
Absolutely. Yeah.
efficiency. All right. So Mohan is already asking a question that I wanted to ask you about. Can you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit more about your recent Nature Sustainability paper and the cumulative carbon opportunity cost of a global dietary change? And I'm actually I found the paper because I'm following you on Twitter now at Matthew Hayek. And
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
going to
Thank
share
you.
that with everybody so that they can see it because I do think it's very excellent. But if you want to summarize any key points, that'd be great.
I don't think that there's an elegant way to bunch it in with that number, right? Because they're kind of two fundamentally different processes. One is how much is coming out of the mouths and the tractors and the fertilizers today. That's what that 15% number from the FAO refers to, or 14.5%. Recently, it changed to something like 15.6. But again, I'm more about the approximation, about the order of magnitude. It's about as bad as the global transportation sector. That should be enough. That's honestly where I, as a scientist, really want to end that conversation.
And that's what's
Um,
understandable.
what's that?
That's what's understandable to
That's what's
people.
understandable. Yeah, it's attainable. It's understandable. But that being said, just because that's coming out of the mouths and bodies and supply chain of animals today, our mitigation opportunity for shifting towards more plant-based diets is actually potentially greater than that. Because if you were to change farming on that particular land so that there weren't cattle belching, in many areas of the world, including the eastern United States, the Brazilian Amazon, you would have land that then would actually be freed up for reforestation. And it's a major misconception that we need to go out and plant those with trees. If it's a humid enough forest, seeds will get in there, grasses will grow, trees will overtake those, bigger trees will overtake those. Areas can be largely reforested within about a 30-year time frame, hands off entirely from humans. If there are arid kind of savannas and dry forests like in the Western United States, you need to be a little bit more intentional about how you kind of restore that landscape. But in many areas, restoration can be passive and colonized with native species. And when that's the case, the opportunity for mitigation is huge. But it's hard to say 15% of emissions, 70, compare that mitigation to the amount of outward emissions, because it depends crucially on the time frame at which you do it. If we start now or if we start in 100 years. And when a forest regrows, its rate of uptake is highly nonlinear. It starts out slow, it gets really fast, and then it saturates where it starts sucking up CO2 a lot more slowly. A growing forest takes up a lot more CO2 than a fully grown forest. Fully grown forest still takes up a little bit, but a growing forest takes up a lot more because it's turning carbon dioxide into its actual tree trunks and leaves and roots, right? That's really what we want. The more forests that are standing on Earth, the more CO2 is being kept out of the atmosphere and stored in those trunks. Forests are like a bank, and we not only need to stop the deforestation that's going on now, we need to actively reforest and pull more of that CO2 out of the air. Reducing the scope and size of animal agriculture is a major potential mitigation tool in that way.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you how the reception has been to your paper. I saw that it was in the 99th percentile in terms of being shared. It seems to really be reaching a lot of audiences. Can you tell us a little bit about what the reception to that paper has been like?
It's really been largely positive, less negative than I thought it would even be. I mean, it's tough, being the PI on the problem. I'm very much a naysayer to myself, so I think I was able to cover a lot of my bases and add a really kind of meaty, pun intended, supplement to the article where we actually go on for an additional 12, 13, 14 pages describing all of the, nuance that we paid attention to in the modeling. In addition to that 3-page report that we did, on the front page of Nature Sustainability. So it has been way more positive than I anticipated. I've had a couple people come out of the woodwork, but really the biggest naysayers of it seem to be the regenerative ag folks, which has been
Yes, let's talk
very,
about
very
regenerative
interesting.
So before we actually even jumped on this call with all the rest of you, we've been talking about regenerative ag. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it is a huge topic, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts about regenerative agriculture and just some of your main talking points.
So look, there's always ways to improve the forms of agriculture that we're doing right now. Regenerative agriculture, it's tough to actually pin down what that means in the first place because different people using it means different things. For some, it means just like running your tills over the soil a little less. For some, it means eschewing all pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. So it's a bit of a moving target to try to engage with seriously to an extent because it means different things to different people. And when you're creating a Netflix documentary on the issue, you just throw everything into the same pile and say, look, it's going to heal the planet. It can't heal the planet. It can offset some of agriculture's, the set of practices that regenerative agriculture advocates for can offset a fraction of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the food system. Some of those are sensible, but there's no reason why we can't also have a predominantly plant-based agricultural system that shares regenerative agriculture, or what I would just call conservation techniques like tilling the soil less, planting cover crops. If we do, when we do, we will still have animals around, using them a little bit more widely and wisely and rotating them through some of the fields to graze on the stubble from the crops. All of these things are good ideas, and they're things that we can think about incentivizing and scaling or punishing farmers who don't do them even. But in and of itself, regenerative agriculture can't take a serious bite out of the climate problem if we continue eating and producing the same things that we're producing. Looking at cattle, for instance, my analysis showed that moving from abandoning grain feedlots and moving all the cattle on pasture, there just isn't enough room in the country for it. We would increase our land requirements by 3.5 times what it is today. And that's a big deal because we already use about 30% of the country to graze and produce feed for cattle. So it's just a non-starter. So this is in part why I did this paper is there were corporate commitments even around having less, having better beef. And many other folks like NGOs were saying we need less and better beef. But less beef meant like, I don't know, a meatless Monday or trim 10% of it out. If we want to free range all of our beef, that means eating probably a half to two-thirds, cutting a half to two-thirds of it out of our diet. So yes, less and better beef, but also way less. And that's what our kind of current land base in the United States can sustain. And then let's make it, better. Let's make it a little bit more rotationally grazed and sustainable for the remaining fraction that we have.
Thank you. Okay, so you're talking about a predominantly plant-based agricultural system. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about like what we need to get there, what we need to raise the awareness so that we move in that direction. Because the title of this series is Culture Shift, and we're really
Yeah.
trying to figure out, like, we've been raising awareness for a decade now. You've been doing your research. What do you think it's going to take for us to shift the norm from our current state to one where there is like predominantly a plant-based agricultural system? What do you think our consumers need to hear about like the current conditions? What policies broadly do you think that we need to enact and support?
It's really expansive. I'm not really a policy and social systems expert. One thing that I can see from a movement direction is I think the animal movement is way past time to embrace the larger climate movement, not from a position of sideline judgment from the sidelines of saying, why won't you take this animal issue seriously, but getting up on the front lines and sharing common concern and cause for these issues. Uh, so, as one example for the folks here, can I see an actual hand raised or a virtual hand raised if you've ever gone out and protested, lobbied against the construction of a coal or gas fired power plant? Awesome. Great. I'm seeing some people have. Um, I think if I saw half or more of the folks in this room raise that hand, there would be a lot of more good faith and trust garnered, engendered in the climate movement, because again, fossil fuels are the biggest slice of the pie. There would be a lot more trust engendered in the climate movement um, to onboard and stop marginalizing this animal agricultural issue. So when we stop saying you over there talk about my cause, as opposed to stepping into the conversation and say, where can we find common cause? That is really what I think the animal protection movement can do to hop on board and share the momentum and coalition building with the serious traction that the climate movement has gained. We have a much more mainstream conversation in the White House right now of eliminating fossil fuel use in the Biden administration than we did in the Obama administration. And but there's still so much moral panic around the idea of even touching a hamburger. And I don't really want to go into the whole right-wing conversation that's happening right now about that. But we need to make animal agriculture a wider mainstream progressive issue. I think that's in part what it's really going to take. And then a bunch of things that y'all are talking about, right? Regulating factory farming, making it pay its fair share of environmental pollution, getting it to internalize its externalities like pandemic disease risk, water pollution, racial injustice, and polluting in predominantly BIPOC area neighborhoods. All of those things are great, and encouraging the alternatives from beans and lentils to the next generation alternative meat. All of that stuff is a great idea. All of those things need to go hand in hand. But I think from a movement building perspective, I think jumping into the coalition building and into the fray rather than lobbying not accusing anyone here of doing that, but lobbying attacks from the sidelines, really stepping in, asking for common cause, common concern. Cornel West says that justice is what love looks like in public. And I think we need to embody more of that love, that common concern.
Thanks, Matthew. That's actually exactly our approach. And we've been working with environmental audiences for a long time, and it really does come out of that shared concern. And what we are trying to do, I think, in order to make this more mainstream, is really show that there is this common cause, that these are interconnected issues. It's not coming from a single perspective.
Yeah,
So,
and I like that intersectionality slide of the wheel of all of the issues on it.
mm,
I think that that type of thing is exactly what I'm talking about.